There's a swath of people who claim to have seen the real cookie-eating, gift-giving, dressed-in-red jolly man himself. But these encounters aren't always as festive as they might first seem. Since it's the holiday season, we're gonna do something fun, and today we're looking at some close encounters of the Claus kind, here at the Insomnia Society. This first story comes from a man named Jason Q, who posted his experience on liveabout.com, which all our stories today come from. He was 5 years old, living in Gresham, Oregon in 1976, and his father had been transferred to a job miles away from their home. So that night, on Christmas Eve, he went to sleep in his parents' room with his mother. Early in the morning, they both awoke to a sound on the roof. Jason's mother, thinking it was burglars, told him to keep still as she made for the window to see what it was. He asked her what was on the roof, but she just stood there, dazed. Unable to restrain himself on Christmas Eve, he got out of bed. On the roof of his house was Santa, sleigh, reindeer, and all. He watched in amazement as Santa spirited the reindeer off the roof and into the night sky. They didn't speak a word of the encounter to one another, and we're left to speculate how they got back to bed. He kept it secret for years, until he was asked to write a personal story he had of Christmas for a high school project. He recited his tale, and not surprisingly, he was mocked by his peers for it. But something strange happened after class. He was approached by a student he hadn't seen before. The student remarked on his story, telling him, if one truly believes, he may at one time in his life experience what you experienced. And Jason never saw the student again after this exchange. He decided then to bring it up to his mother, just to be sure it had actually happened. With no influence from him, she described the exact same experience, even down to hearing the bells chiming from the sleigh. And what's more is that she had noticed physical evidence in the snow on the roof. Hoof marks and sleigh tracks, indicating it was more than a dream or a shared hallucination. She herself had asked the husband when he returned home if he had anything to do with it, but he denied all involvement and was already away on the job. This to me sounds way too close to an alien encounter. The mother was in a dazed state, which is to be expected for someone seeing Santa, but this is also all too common in alien abductions. Abductees will report a paralysis effect, sometimes followed by a buzzing or electric feeling, and this is followed after by a blackout or an experience of missing or manipulated time. There's also a theory that aliens can change appearance based on the perception of those viewing them. So with that, it'd be no shock if they did change form to Santa on Christmas Eve, especially while people are thinking about him the most. It's strange too that he was approached after telling the story publicly for the first time. People who report accounts of abductions or UFO sightings are sometimes approached by people called Men in Black, but we don't really know if they're people. Usually they're described as tall, uncanny, and looking almost like a human robot or mannequin, or someone wearing the costume of a human. Their purpose normally seems to be scaring witnesses into silence, but this time, possibly wanting to inform the boy they knew he knew, but not to scare him enough to get adults involved, gave words of encouragement. Or, alternatively, they want the story out there, perhaps as a message, with the belief in the story itself giving them the strength to appear, something we'll look at a little later in this video. This next story too could be considered an abduction with missing time. An Andy W. tells that when he was about 8 or 9 years old, he awoke early on Christmas morning with an odd feeling. Even though he wasn't supposed to be awake this early, he made his way to the stairs. It was a 2-tiered staircase and he couldn't see around the first level. This is where things got weird, and he said he seemed to float down to the landing. From here he was able to see the Christmas tree, and next to it was his sister, talking to a man with a white beard and a red jacket. Andy ran down the stairs and hugged the man immediately. The man showed them gifts and asked them to get back to bed, which they did. Andy awoke later, confused at what had happened earlier, but Christmas went on like normal. Later in life, he asked his sister if she remembered anything about it, and she had remembered hearing a noise and waking up and then ending up back in bed, but none of the stuff in between. This next story is short, but another odd one. A small girl of 7 named Jade was lying in her bed on Christmas Eve of 2003, unable to sleep. Suddenly, she was struck with a red beam that shot through her window. She states it was very bright and somehow she, quote, knew it was him. Looking out her window, she saw the bright light coming from a small ship hovering in the sky. But there wasn't the sound of a helicopter or anything similar. She heard the jingle of bells and the sound of hooves tapping on her roof. As quick as it came, the light disappeared and the sounds on the roof with it. Beams of light are a common motif in UFO encounters, and it seemed to be emitting from a craft, which would also make sense. But her saying she, quote, knew it was him gives us a little more information than one might think. Now, it's impossible to verify if this user also had any UFO encounters besides this one. But something else we'll sometimes see from abductees is a pre-knowledge that they're going to be abducted, whether they know it consciously or not. This will involve things like compulsively checking the locks of doors and windows, or a feeling of something familiar that you can't quite put your finger on. It's possible that this was a familiar experience for her, and this just happened to be the only time that she was able to remember it, possibly due to her excitement of Christmas Eve. But what do our historians say about Santa Claus? Our knowledge of Santa Claus can be traced back to a man named Saint Nicholas, born in 270 AD, who became a saint due to his charity and love of children. Our first technical Claus encounter of history took place in Myra, a town in the country of Turkey. Nicholas had heard of the plight of some girls in town. They wanted to marry, but their father couldn't afford the dowry. Knowing he was a proud man who wouldn't accept charity, this is when Nicholas, Bishop of Myra, jumped into action. Legend goes he would ride by in the night throwing bags of gold through the window, and in some, he's able to throw them with such skill the bags of gold land in the stockings, neatly hung to dry by the fire. Rumor has it, he was so popular that he was able to train with the shamans of Lapland and the reindeer people of Siberia, who were able to make reindeer fly, and this is where he got his sled pulling team from. Something the historians haven't given us, though, is an explanation on how he gets in and out of a building, even without a chimney or an open window. Well, it's all too possible Santa might not be completely corporeal. Here's another story from 1976, and takes place in Brooklyn, New York. A 6-year-old boy named Richard lived in a small apartment. His room was partitioned off the living room, but to make space for the tree, the partition had been taken down. And on Christmas Eve, he lay in bed watching the brightly lit greenery. He nodded off a few times during the night, but suddenly awoke. Standing near the presents was a small figure, only about 1 or 2 feet tall. There wasn't a body, but the outline of static like an old TV. It remained still, and he watched it for several minutes, straining his eyes open, until finally he rubbed them for a quick second and the figure was gone. He stayed awake the rest of the night, but never saw it again. Was it a hallucination? Maybe a dream, and once he rubbed his eyes, he woke back up? We may never know, but it's far from the only encounter with unique otherworldly beings we plan on covering. So, if you want to see cases involving things like this, and this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss some really weird creatures. One of those creatures is called a tulpa, and it's a being that's said to come into existence when there's enough belief in it. Think along the lines of a real-life imaginary friend, and it's possible Santa could be just that. With millions of people all over the world believing in him, it might just help bring him to life. But what happens when a non-believer has a Claus encounter? On Christmas Eve of 2002, in New York City, Claxton was celebrating the holiday with his parents and some of their friends. He was a bit older, so when they had all settled in to watch a movie, he excused himself to go to his room. His house was fairly large, and out of boredom, he soon found himself pacing in the hall. After a few minutes of this, he noticed a tall, fat figure scurry away about 20 feet from him. It was crouched down and appeared to be wearing a Santa suit. Not a believer in Santa, he was nervous there was a strange man in the house and ran to the living room to tell his parents and others. They didn't believe him, so he sat in the living room with them, each one accounted for. This wouldn't be his only sighting. 2 years later, on Christmas Eve of 2004, he was laying on his couch as his parents discussed business in the kitchen. Out of nowhere, an 8-foot-tall man dressed as Santa crawled underneath the tree and vanished, only stopping for a moment to turn around and give a shh to Claxton. Not knowing what else to do, and knowing they wouldn't believe him, he went and sat with his parents in the kitchen. So, what are all these encounters people are reporting with a big man in red? An interactive spirit with a penchant for dressing up? Or, it's quite possible the belief in Santa Claus himself is enough to make him appear in our reality. No matter the case, he continues to bring joy to people around the world every Christmas. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and if you want to give me an early Christmas gift, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you back here for the next Insomnia Society episode. It gets weird out there, so stay safe, guys.